Miyamoto Musashi's 17th principle in the Dokkodo is do not fear death. We often treat death as if it is a bad thing, not something that is merely natural and inevitable. Musashi also says in the Book of Five Rings that, generally speaking, the way of the warrior is resolute acceptance of death. Now, there's a practical reason for that. On the battlefield, you have to make quick decisions. If your mind is full of the fear of death, you might cower away, you might shell up, you might freeze, and in that moment of indecision, you could be killed, you could die. So there's a practical reason not to fear death. You have to ignore the fear of death or come to terms with it to be able to make those quick decisions, to battle your enemy, to take risks. Because sometimes taking a risk, which is one that you could die from, is better than not making a decision at all. Sometimes you just have to move, you have to act, you have to swing your sword to survive. So for a practical reason, fearing death ends up being detrimental to the warrior on the battlefield. And the same applies to regular life. Our fear of death can stop us from doing things that might make our life experience all the more rich, all the more beautiful. If you think about all those fun, adrenaline-rushing things, they sort of have a relationship to death. If you think about even sports and combat sports specifically, martial arts, there's an element of pain and suffering to that which simulates death. Essentially, what martial arts is the simulation of war in a controlled environment. And although deaths are very rare in martial arts and combat sports, they can happen. And the pain and suffering and the risk of injury that comes with martial arts and competing in martial arts sort of resembles the risk of death. So it's important to take risks to live life more richly and more beautifully. Now, the more spiritual reason to why we must accept death resolutely is the sense that death is the final thing that we do in this life. It's the final thing we do on earth before we go on, regardless of if experience ends there or if there's an afterlife. This is the last physical thing we do. If you're a soldier, for example, or a warrior, and you're a coward in your final moments, that's going to be what your comrades remember. And if they survive and they make it out of the battle, the last thing they will remember of you is you being a coward. And you think about the mental toll that will have on them, or if it's a family member, even if your comrade in arms was a brother and they see you afraid in the last moments, they're either going to see you as a coward or they'll pity you and they'll think about how afraid you were. But if in that final moment of death you show courage and resoluteness in the face of death and you smile back at death, then they will remember that and that could inspire them in life. So your death has ramifications in the world. And even if there's no one to witness your death, that's still the last exchange of energy that you leave on this planet. And that, I think, is something important. It's not so much when we die that is important, but the amount of things that we achieved before our deaths. It's like I was talking about. You might live your best years early on and the rest of your life could be horrible. The best things that you do don't necessarily come with a longer life, and sometimes they do. Some people end up being successful much later in life, and that's a good and beautiful thing. But it's not always the case. It's not the length of life that makes a good life. It's what you did in that amount of time, how much beauty you experienced, how much you achieved. These are the things that matter. All great things require sacrifice, and at times, risking our lives. Alexander the Great died at the age of 32, very young, and yet he accomplished so much in that time. And throughout that time, he risked his life again and again. He wasn't merely a good general, but a great warrior. He always led from the front. He always took on the burdens of the rest of his army. He even said so in a speech when his army had been led deep into India. They were far from their homes. They missed their families, and they wanted to turn back. And he gave a speech, and he said, "I have done everything that you all have done. I have not asked you to do anything I would not do myself." He led from the front. He risked his life again and again. He broke bones. He had his arms slashed by swords. He was in the face of death, and he dealt with death daily with them. And that's one of the reasons I think his life was so profound and so great. And not merely the accomplishments, but the experience. He experienced everything his soldiers did. And that's why they loved him so much. So it's not merely the length of your life, but what you achieved in the amount of time that you lived. And, you have Alexander the Great dying at 32, while you could have someone living to the age of 100 but never really having accomplished anything, or never really having experienced the beauty of life. It's kind of like in the film Braveheart. William Wallace says, many years from now, dying in your beds, would you have been willing to give one chance to come back here and tell our enemies, you may take our lives, but you'll never take our freedom? And essentially what he means by that is, yes, you may die now in battle, but at least you died as a man and as a free man, and you died fighting for something you believed in, rather than dying old and sick in a bed somewhere. And that's not to say that's a bad death, but it shows you it's not the length of life that matters, but what you achieve during it. It's not death itself that's the evil or bad thing, but it's really life and how you lived your life that makes death either good or bad. Death itself is neither good nor bad. It just is. So that's something to consider. And it's also important to consider that, like I said, some people die old and in horrible ways. They don't have control over their bodies anymore. They lack physical control and sometimes even mental control. They're just not there anymore. And what kind of life is that at that point? Maybe if they had chosen to charge with their comrades and die, maybe much younger, but the matter of their death held a great amount of experience in it and human experience. Maybe they would have chosen that rather than dying old and infirm and really not being able to control their lives at all for the last 10 years. And it's not to say that dying young was good either, but it becomes a lot more nuanced and complicated when you consider all these different things. It's also important to recognize that in nature, you don't really see living organisms grow old, at least animals. And sometimes you do. The animals that are able to avoid being preyed upon. So like you see really old turtles. I guess those shells are good for something, or tortoises, I should say. Certain sharks live for a long time. I believe it's the Greenland shark. So some animals do grow old, right? Humans grow old. But humans in the state of nature didn't grow old because we are a warring breed. We are like lions. There are no old lions because once a lion grows old, another lion comes along, a younger lion, and challenges him for leadership of the pride. So lions don't grow old. They die fighting and battling. And so nature you don't really see old age oftentimes in nature. And the same applied for the state of nature of the early humans as well. There's a lot of opportunities nowadays to choose to prolong your life, even if that prolonging of life isn't necessarily a good thing. It doesn't necessarily bring with you a better life. So sort of these interesting things to talk about. And another thing with Alexander the Great, and I've mentioned this in a video before, in the film Alexander, like I said, there's one cut that is pretty good. I think it was the ultimate cut or the final cut, which is a lot better, but still a flawed movie, but I think it was very beautiful as well. There's a scene where young Alexander is walking with his father, Philip, and they see a painting of Achilles in this cave. And Achilles was his favorite hero. And Alexander said it was Achilles' fate to die young. And his father said, did he have a choice? And Alexander said yes. And if you've ever watched the film Troy, you see that choice in the film where Achilles' mother tells him, if you stay, you will grow old and you will have a family, you'll meet a beautiful woman, and your children will remember you, and their children will remember you, but eventually you'll be forgotten. But if you go to Troy, you will die there, but you will be remembered forever. And it's not to say that one or the other is necessarily a better life. It's just to say that there is nuance to it. The way Achilles lived his life isn't necessarily the way everybody should or wants to live their life. Same goes for Alexander. But it just goes to show that the long life isn't inherently good because it is long, and the short life isn't inherently bad because it's short. Death is not what is bad, but it is the manner of death and the manner of life before death that makes it good or bad. Some people die young but have achieved so much more than those who have died old. The brightest flames sometimes burn twice as fast. The Stoic philosopher Seneca talks about death as the final duty of life, and it is the final step of life and an integral part of it. So it's not something that should be feared, but something that should be understood. Death is not evil. Death is not bad. It just is. So that's something to think about. Do not fear death. And if you wish to live the way of the warrior, accept it resolutely. This is The Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the warrior philosophy. See you next time.